Hello, Unlockers. Welcome to the 8th episode of the Unlocking the Energy Trilemma podcast with our hosts Ravi Krishnan and Jose A. Martinez, JAM. Today, Ravi and JAM speak with Scott Hargreaves, Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. Before joining IPA, Scott worked in roles with a heavy emphasis on the energy sector, with agencies of the Victorian Government, Meridian Energy, Anglo-American, and Origin Energy. Ravi, JAM, over to you.
Thank you, Ava, and welcome, Scott, to the podcast of the Unlocking the Energy Trilemma.
Thanks so much for having me.
As we always ask to our guests, we request them to give us a fact or figure that is relevant to the energy trilemma. The IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, recently presented a very provocative report named the Ruinous cost of free energy, and probably is something coming from there?
Yes, let's do that. So the ruinous cost of free energy was trying to address this often stated idea that sunshine is free and wind is free, therefore the energy must be cheap. And what we looked at was the effect that these intermittent sources of energy had on our national electricity market, which is an integrated market that covers most of Australia, all bar Western Australia, so a very massive geographical network. And what we found through all our research and all the modelling that we'd reviewed, and indeed observations, is that there's basically been a doubling of the cost of energy in the national electricity market as we have moved from one based on baseload coal-fired energy towards one where the penetration of intermittent energy has been such that, in fact, gas has been setting the marginal price. And furthermore, that if the targets set under our energy transmission plan to reach unprecedented levels of penetration of renewable energy, 82% by 2030, could ever be met, that would represent a further doubling of the cost of energy, just wholesale energy, not even counting transmission. So that is, in Australian dollars, we've moved from a system that was delivering at about $50 a megawatt hour to one that is now roughly $100 a megawatt hour. And if we proceeded with the plans that the government has in place, we would push that up to $200 a megawatt hour. So it's a ratio of 1 to 4, if you like. And so that's the summary of what's presented in that paper on the ruinous cost of free energy.
Scott, perhaps this is a good point where you can delve upon some of the common misconceptions the public perhaps has about renewable energy and its costs. Do you have a view on that? And from an Australian perspective?
I think it's not just the general public that has misconceptions, but some of the ones that I mentioned in the report, perhaps a misunderstanding of how things scale. And so to start with a simple one that we often see at the level of the consumer, who doesn't love solar energy? It's clean, it comes from the sun. And we have a heavily subsidised rollout of rooftop solar in Australia. And many Australians sign up to that. They're enthusiastic about it. They don't realise how heavily subsidised the capital cost was, or indeed the feed-in tariffs that they receive for it. But in any event, so they're very enthusiastic about it. What is not understood is the system effects that has on the distribution system and into the wholesale market, that whilst at times, obviously, that solar energy can produce a great deal of input, because it's not reliable, because there's no energy security, you have all the backups elsewhere in the system. And so what's not understood is that this does not scale. You can have a little bit of rooftop solar, you can have a certain amount of wind and solar connected to the network, industrial scale solar and wind, but it doesn't scale. 20% penetration might be okay, but 40% penetration is not twice as good. It's probably 4 times as bad for the reliability and ultimately the cost of the system. That would be an example of a misconception.
And part of this noise could come because we are using a unit, a metric, which is the levelized cost of energy. And using that metric, we can demonstrate that renewables or wind and solar particularly are much cheaper than other sources. However, probably that's not the best metric to compare drop by drop.
Indeed, it's not. It can be a full tool at an incremental cost, at a margin, and this is a misconception which is not so much the average person on the street, but many otherwise sensible market participants, because it's similar to a discounted cash flow analysis that the average investor uses. So they're used to looking at it and they're thinking about an investment into a market. And in some ideas, in some locations, in some circumstances, maybe a wind farm or a industrial solar park could be presented as producing the best outcome and a levelized cost of energy. But it's the wrong metric to look at an energy system, because that incremental supply is triggering calls for backup elsewhere in the system. First of all, from batteries, which is commonly accepted, but in reality, the backup of the backup is then gas. So what we were trying to do in this paper is say, stop using levelized cost of energy as a planning tool for the system as a whole. We should be looking at total system cost, and it's total system cost analysis that produced the overall outcomes that I just described before.
If I understand you, I think you argue that increasing reliance on intermittent renewable energy can reduce energy security and perhaps increase costs. How do you respond to proponents of renewable energy who argue that advancements in technology like energy storage, for example, will eventually mitigate these issues?
In one sense, if advances in technology came along which were genuinely step change in the cost of storage, in the cost of firming up renewables, then you might have a case. But I'm sure you gentlemen have been around the energy market for a long time, and it's one of those classic technological breakthroughs that always seems to be about 5 years away, And certainly there's nothing truly prospective about a technological breakthrough. Here in Australia, by the way, we have very few options for backup from hydro systems. We only have 2 major hydro schemes which are pretty much fully developed. And so we're looking at pumped hydro, very expensive pumped hydro schemes, large environmental impacts. So there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to the backup. And we work with the technologies that we have. And right at the moment, they're just rendering these very expensive numbers that we talked about.
Last 17th of July, there was a new record of operational demand in Queensland with nearly 9 gigawatts of consumption. And despite all the renewables installed, that day only 2.5% of wind was producing electricity at 7 p.m. and 0.7% of batteries. So let's say about 3% of all the investment was helping to cover the demand. What do we do? Is that the future? So the backup of something has to be 100% backup?
Yes. There's many things that come off that remarkable statistic. Thank you, Jose. One that occurs to me that is really built into this total system cost is like the return on capital plus the fuel cost of whatever system you have. And what intermittency drives us to is a massive overbuild. We're probably already overbuilt in places like South Australia to 2 or 3 times. And because you think about it, you've got an intermittent system. If that intermittent sources of generation are really driving up towards 82%, then even the batteries need recharging. So you need extra capacity to recharge the batteries. So you're building more and more capacity all the time. Occasionally, it might deliver very large percentages of energy when there's peak sunshine, peak wind. But then you've created this overbuilt system, and that capital has to be serviced. And of course, as I hardly need to mention to any listener of this podcast, the whole point of energy is it's a 24/7 system. And the demand has to be met by the supply at every given moment. Otherwise, there's real reliability issues.
In other words, are you saying that subsidies and market regulations are actually distorting the true cost of renewables? And what can be done to address that?
There's the old adage, first of all, when you're in a hole, stop digging. We think the saturation level of renewable energies has probably already been met in the Australian context. We've looked at it, we've compared it not with, there's an often facile comparison, say with Denmark. Say Denmark's installed capacity is 100% renewables, but as we know, there are interconnectors all over the place. So you got to look at compare grid systems with grid systems, and we've done that. And Australia has got one of the highest penetrations of renewables in the world, driven by subsidies, and that has a knock-on effect because it then reduces the utilisation of the baseload power stations, which should be the foundation of any reliable and affordable system. It reduces their utilisation down from figures with an 80 in front of it to a 60 in front of it. They become unfinanceable, prone to early retirements. It's often claimed that they are aging, but they're not really aging. They're just being driven out of the market, unable to earn a return on capital. So the first thing I'd say is stop digging, stop the subsidies and the government-financed investments into further renewable energy, intermittent renewable energy projects like particularly industrial scale wind and solar, because we really need, it's time to reset and stop clinging to that original dream of an energy transition plan, because those plans aren't stacking up.
You mentioned energy transition plans. In a transition, you are replacing one source of energy by another source of energy. But in general, at least on average in the globe, the energy is growing and growing. So it's difficult to replace something when you are growing. So are we moving from an energy transition perspective to an energy addition perspective where the renewables could be very helpful?
I think that's Jose, I think that's a very realistic way of looking at it. We've seen too many predictions that there's going to be some kind of secular trend down in energy consumption. And of course, we do see that in the West, in the OECD countries. Energy demand has been relatively flat. Things like server farms and so on might be sources of additional demand. Certainly in Australia, it's been relatively flat, but of course, on the global basis, as you say, it's going to require a massive scale of investment to supply the developing world's demand for energy as low and middle income countries ascend through the energy intensive curve. And so it is a bit facile to be claiming that, well, we can just shut down one source of energy and bring in another, because we're going to need all forms. And of course, that's another part of the focus here in Australia, where we really, the only replacement that we should be contemplating for a baseload thermal energy is baseload nuclear energy. But that is currently prohibited by Australian law, which is, to use a technical term, insane.
So in the context of what you're saying, do you believe that net zero by the targets that Australia has put for itself is actually achievable?
For Australia, I'm agnostic on net zero by 2050. I think these are the sort of targets that have actually blinded policymakers to all sorts of positive developments. We're in a central planning mindset. This idea that system planners can gather in a room in Canberra or Washington or Brussels and determine what the global energy market or the Australian energy market is going to look like in 2050 is hubris, arrogance of the highest order. Ravi and Jose, you're talking about the energy trilemma, which is real. There are always trade-offs. The better way for global policymakers to think about these things is directions. Decarbonisation is something that could be a legitimate policy direction, but work in that direction, keep an eye on the strategy, utilise technological developments as they come along, but it's not actually useful to set a target like net zero by 2050, and particularly not then, as we do in Australia and most other jurisdictions, to also then say, and we've got a target for 2045, we've got a target for 2030, we're going to close down coal-fired power stations by 2025, which is what we've said in Australia. This whole business of targets is the wrong way to go.
You mentioned Denmark before and interconnections between system operators. I think in Central Europe, interconnections are key and are easy to deploy or to increase the size of them. And they are bringing a lot of volatility in the prices of electricity. But let's say it's a tool. We have in the States, the interconnection between system operators, it's a little bit more difficult, but with Australia, it's an island far away from elsewhere. Are interconnection a real possibility for a theoretically rich energy country?
We have interconnectors between the different states, which are also regions of our national electricity market, and we've probably utilised the economically efficient benefits of those interconnectors balancing up between the regions. But it's also, and we also have the potential for more hydropower from one of the existing schemes in the separate island of Tasmania via a subsea link, but I'm not convinced about the economics of that. But interconnectors bring their own reliability issues as well. And I think also interconnectors, they're usually by agreement between jurisdictions, and they rely on a certain assumption that both parties are equally interested in energy security. If I could take an example from Queensland, which is a net exporter, one of the New South Wales generators closed. And so what you're seeing is ever more demand to flow south out of Queensland. This creates a political dynamic which could actually backfire on the whole system. I think I'm told that a similar thing has happened actually with Scandinavia, which was happy to have interconnectors with Germany until for a while there it became very much a one-way flow as Germany shut down baseload coal and nuclear, and suddenly the interconnector from Scandinavia was being called upon just to deliver baseload energy at some cost to the volatility of supply in Scandinavia. So I think that's really the saturation point for interconnectors.
Just moving over to a public policy issue. On one side, Australia weaning itself away from coal domestically, while continuing to export coal to countries like India and some other Asian countries. How can this be explained in terms of Australia's energy policy issue? What is Australia's energy policy. You see the safeguard mechanism that calls for reduction in carbon emissions on one side, and on the other side, export of fossil fuels. Can you explain that to us?
You're asking me to make coherent and rational Australia's energy policy, Ravi, and which is probably logically impossible. If I was ChatGPT, I'd probably be having a meltdown by about now. But in general terms, the political economy, if you like, has been that domestic desire for clean energy is manifested in policies which seem to be driving the thermal coal, or at least coal-fired power out of our domestic system, whilst the somewhat mercantilist view is that exports are good and we can put up with exports. So whilst our green parties would prefer that we don't export either, there does seem to be a bipartisan willingness to, in theory, continue exporting coal. On the other hand, things like the safeguards mechanism to reduce point source emissions from mines, along with various other environmental hurdles, lawfare, nature positive principles coming into Australian law, are actually going to make it very hard for investors to continue to fulfill the energy needs of North Asia, as we have been doing, into the next couple of decades. We face a real prospect that almost by neglect rather than through an explicit plan, we won't be able to supply coal and LNG to our partners in Japan, India, Taiwan, South Korea, as we have been doing for decades. Australia has energy security obligations to our partners, which we are at some risk of defaulting upon.
Okay, Scott, it has been a very interesting conversation, and would like to close it with the same question to the rest of the guests. If you had a magic wand, what would you ask it to unlock the energy trilemma?
For me, the trilemma is real. I did mention this in passing. I'd just say the magic wand is that there is no magic wand, there is no silver bullet. I prefer to think of energy policy making as a vector. I think all that we can do, given that we're up against fundamental laws of thermodynamics and other system constraints and resource constraints, is all energy policy makers can really do is indicate that they'd like to head in a certain direction and they're willing to expend a certain amount of a nation's resources on heading in that direction. But let's get away from these arbitrary targets for decades ahead, because that is a losing proposition.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me, gentlemen.
Yes,
Great
thank you
chat.
very much, Scott. Yes, and we look forward to discussing more about Australia's energy policy with you. It's constantly evolving and can be quite interesting for our audience, as Australia leads in some ways, is in the forefront of carbon mitigation, and in other ways not. So it's an ironical situation. So thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing our discussion. Thank you. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope we helped you to create an opinion on energy transition. Follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe for free to the podcast on the platform of your choice: Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or Apple. Because in the next episode, Ravi and JAM will speak with another international expert of the energy sector.